I'll start off by welcoming everybody to our History Week event. This year is our second year that it's been a virtual guest speaker event, and we've also this year extended the online presence to our exhibition being online through Facebook. We're still in lockdown and likely to be for a little while. So thank you all for joining us. And I would just like to say here in Lithgow Library Learning Centre, we gather on country on which members of and elders of the local First Nations community and their forebears have been custodians for many centuries, and on which First Nations people have performed age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. We acknowledge their living culture and their unique role in the life of the region. I would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past, present and emerging of the Wiradjuri nation, and extend that respect to other First Nations people present today. And I will introduce you to Sharon Tollard, our library coordinator, and thank you for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Lithgow Library's History Week presentation. We're lucky enough to have Peter Baker online, and I've had a bit of a look through Peter's book here, and I've even tagged pages that I find quite impressive. And anyway, Peter was born in Manly and lived in Western Sydney for the past 40 years with his wife Sandra and his children. He studied law and arts at the University of New South Wales and was a partner in a Blacktown legal practice for almost 30 years. He has always enjoyed researching and writing, particularly short stories, family histories and historical essays. And we must say how pleased we are that he does enjoy those things, having written such a great book. Having retired, has increased his writing output and is a member of the Lithgow District Family History Society Incorporated. And so what brings us here, obviously, is Sidestepping Shrapnel, his first non-fiction book. And as you can see, my tags are already in this book. And I just really love the photographs in it. I think they capture, well, being historical novel and all non-fiction piece. I just really love the photos, and say to anybody to come to the library, borrow a copy and check it out. The book examines the deep tradition of rugby union in New South Wales coal mining town of Lithgow, and at the turn of the 20th century. And it goes through the lives of the young men who dared to play a new game of football, being rugby league, and the war that engulfed the same men and brought back the survivors to challenge rugby league country supremacy. So for everybody out there that is either a fan of history or a fan of rugby league, or just truly loves historical photos, I'm sure you'll enjoy not only Peter's talk today, but his book. Peter, over to you.
Sharon, that's very kind words you said there, and also to Kay, thanks very much. Yeah, the theme of the History Week seminar is from the ground up. So I too think that if you're going to talk from the ground up, you have to talk about beginnings. And I want to acknowledge the Darug people whose land I sit at the moment, and I want to extend respect to them and to other Aboriginal people who may be watching today. By all means, text questions, and I'll answer those questions, or try to answer those questions after the meeting. I also understand the presentation will be recorded, but the questions and answers won't be recorded. The book I wrote, Sidestepping Shrapnel, is a story of Lithgow footballers between 1908 and 1921. The theme is a tussle between the rise of rugby league and the established rugby union game, the potential the influential characters who were involved in Lithgow, the intrusion of World War I, and the rise of the Lithgow Diggers rugby league team after the war. My project was very much from the ground up. I am not an academic historian. This is my first book. I am not a Lithgow resident. Friends of mine ask me, why are you talking about Lithgow history? The simple answer is that Lithgow history and that of Western New South Wales is interesting. In many ways, what happened in Lithgow in this period was a microcosm of what was happening in Australia. Industrialisation, the rise of sport, war and its aftermath, conscription, pandemics, job security. I enjoyed researching and writing it. I say and write because many of us research but never seem to write it up. If you're working on local history, it's essential to not stop once the research is finished. Writing is essential because if we don't write the narrative, it's likely that all our notes are likely to end up as mulch. As part of the presentation, I will take you through some interesting photographs that in many respects speak louder than words. But before I get into the presentation, I just want to show you this photo out of curiosity and amusement. It was taken during Country Week 1908, rugby union game between Central Southern District and Northern Rivers, I think, District. And I was just wondering if anyone out there might be able to tell me the reason a player from each side is wearing a floppy hat and not a rugby cap or any headgear. I'd be very grateful to hear from you. This is just a short timeline of the major rugby events in the period. In 1908, rugby league commenced competition-wise in Sydney, but between 1908 and 1913, there was no rugby league in Lithgow, no competition in Lithgow, although in the middle of 1913, the two things happened. One, the Small Arms Factory had formed a rugby league team, which played in the Bathurst competition, and then rugby union as a first grade competition collapsed in Lithgow. The following year, 1914, the first Lithgow Rugby League competition commenced. The war intervened, and in 1920 and 1921, the Lithgow Diggers came into being and played in the first grade competition in Lithgow. The adversaries at the New South Wales level at the time, from an administrative point of view, was on the one hand William Wilson Hill, who had played rugby union for Newtown, New South Wales, before giving it up to take charge of rugby union in Sydney. Edward Ted Larkin was a former police officer, and he played rugby union for New South Wales and Australia, returned to the new game in 1909 and became the state secretary. At age 34, he joined the army and was killed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. But he was mainly responsible for bringing a league to towns in Western New South Wales. But Lithgow was a harder egg to crack for him. On the local level in Lithgow, there are two of the most active people. Was the Secretary for Hartley District Rugby Union, W.A. Carroll. He was a Lithgow local, a talented cricketer, a referee and administrator from a young age. He bore the brunt of the rise of league in Lithgow as he tried to steer the rugby union ship through the change. The other person, his name is Leslie Duncan, nicknamed the Major. He was a very popular personality in Lithgow. He owned a motorcycle repair business. He was a footballer and a coach at the True Blue rugby union side in the early 20th century, and an official who was one of the driving forces behind Small Arms Factory, forming a team in rugby league team in 1913, and he was the first secretary of the Rugby League Association. but for a war injury to his eyes and his sudden death from the flu epidemic months after he was married in 1919, he would without a doubt been a member of the Diggers side of 1920. So what is the story? It's centred around the life of William John Mantle, better known as Pummy Mantle. He's the glue that holds the story together. His life runs parallel with the major events that affected Lithgow and the break from the traditional game of rugby union. The story expands, though, to encompass the champion Lithgow Diggers rugby league side. The players, trainers and administrators are given a chapter to explore their beginnings, their connection to each other and their war duties. Remarkably, today is 100 years exactly since the team won its final competition, the Pedersen Cup, and the Diggers never played another game after that win. Writing these rugby league stories was not a snap decision. It was a 20-year journey for me. In the early 1980s, I read a short biographical article on Douglas Grant, who many of you will know was an Aboriginal taken from his country in North Queensland and raised by a Lithgow couple, Robert and Elizabeth Grant. I started researching Douglas. His story is fascinating on its own. I even had my parents doing some research in the War Memorial at Canberra in the 1980s. And then in 1995, I wrote to the Lithgow Advocate, asking it to publish my request. Anyone who knew Douglas Grant to contact me. And quite a few people wrote to me, but one in particular stood out. Her name was Thorne from Lithgow. And she told me that not only did she know Douglas as a child, but her father had played football with Douglas Grant. Well, I was immediately totally interested in that and kept up the correspondence. And she sent me a fine photograph of the team in which her father played. This next photo shows her father, Fred Ryan, at the top, and Douglas Grant seated next to one of the trophies. The actual photo she sent me is shown here. The men had all, with a few exceptions, arrived home from a horrible war that had taken up to 5 years of their lives. Many in the photograph had suffered war injuries. Here they all were, proud, erect, posing as a football team, a rugby league team. They were not all angels, but there is a sense of resilience and purpose about them. The team was one of many Diggers sporting teams in Australia after the war, but the Lithgow team is unique in its achievements over such a short time. The photograph is also good because it identifies the team, the competitions it won, the names and initials of all the players and trainers, and the positions of the officials. This is a sharper, better copy of the last slide. And one of the first things to strike me about these players, their ages. They look weathered. Some have furrowed brows. They look like they've been through a war. If you compare them to one of their main opponents, the Pottery side, the Diggers played Pottery 4 times in 1921. There were 2 competitions. There was the Premiership competition and a knockout contest called the Pedersen Cup, which was played after the Premiership decided. And Pottery and Diggers were arch rivals. 3 of the games were in the Premiership, which the Diggers won 2 and drew 1. And then Diggers met Pottery in the final of the Pedersen Cup in 1921. That was the game that was played 100 years ago from today. This is the Pottery team. They look like boys, fresh and smiling, officials well-dressed, ties, bow tie, boots shining, set against a grand public building. Although this was taken in 1922, most of these players played in 1921. Now, if you go back to the Diggers side, The trainer and masseur, Snowy Morgan, on the right, has his towel draped over his tight T-shirt. On the left, Bert Hendren, another trainer, has his arms rolled up, his coat's off. And then switch back to the right, you'd see the vice president there with the fob watch hanging out of his waistcoat. His tie is undone at his collar. The jerseys are jaded and faded. The 1921 jerseys were bought with donations. The captain, George Thorne, in the middle there, said the 1920 jerseys were such poor quality that he went through 4 sets in the season. The photo looks like it's been taken on a dusty stretch of field. After Thelma sent me the photograph of the Lithgow diggers, I put it away for 20 years. I was busy with family and business. And when I retired in 2016, I went back to the photo and began to research players. One thing I discovered was that it was easy to go off on a tangent. It was something I had to resist. For example, when I was researching the chapter for Douglas Grant, I came across at the New South Wales State Library the original letters Robert Grant, the substitute father, wrote in 1887 and 1888 to the curator of the Australian Museum from the rainforests of North Queensland. I have never seen any other writer on Douglas Grant refer to these papers. There was no mention of the baby Douglas in the correspondence, but it did refer casually to the war waged against the Aboriginals and the sending of Aboriginal bodies, or mummies, as the collectors call them, to the museum. I decided to include those details in my chapter on Douglas Grant, but I had to bring the story back to Douglas's football skills. Going back to Thelma's photograph, as I call it, I just want to concentrate on Pummy Mantle, whom I mentioned at the beginning. He's central to my story. Pummy's father was killed in the mine disaster of 1886 in the Lithgow Colliery when he was about 6 weeks old. His mother, Kate, remarried John Doig, another miner, and Pummy grew up with 5 half-siblings. Pummy had the drive, the initiative, and the talent to break with rugby union tradition, go down to Sydney and play 5/8 and winger in 1910 for the Western Suburbs rugby league team. And his first game, he came up against Dally Messenger. Messenger was playing in the centres and he was 5'8". So you can imagine how he felt on that day. He was immediately banned by the rugby union establishment in Lithgow and Sydney from playing rugby union again. And when he returned to Lithgow, he couldn't play any football because there was no rugby league competition in Lithgow. It changed in 1913 when the Small Arms Factory created their rugby league team. And in 1914, he was part of the winning Small Arms Factory team that won the initial competition. 3 days after that win, war was declared, and within weeks, he and other soldiers across Lithgow, of course, joined up, and he joined up with the 3rd Battalion, and he was with the Anzacs when they landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April, 1915. These are members of the 3rd Battalion in Lithgow. There are 3 players there that were in the Lithgow Diggers team in the photograph. Pummy Mantle at the front, Harry Hoy in the middle there, and off to the right is Bill Cannon, an Englishman and a front row forward. Sitting down the bottom there, you can see Leslie Duncan as well, who joined up with those other 3 men on the same day. This is a very interesting photograph. It appeared in the Lithgow Mercury the day after the Gallipoli landing. The photo was taken by Leslie Duncan the previous March, and it was taken in, as I said, early 1915. Most of the soldiers, not many casual photos appeared in the press at that time. Most of the photos were soldiers' profiles or taken in studios. This photo is of Lithgow soldiers gathered around the camp in Cairo, and Pummy Mandel is holding a copy of the Lithgow Mercury. One other aspect I wanted to share with you about the photo is that if you look at it in Trove, it's dark and unsatisfactory. I went to the New South Wales State Library and they were very cooperative in getting out the original newspaper and supplying a better quality print. So there's always that option, as many photos in Trove are too dark to try and copy on a standard printer. Like most of the other Lithgow Diggers players, Pummy was injured and battled on for the rest of the war. And when the war was over, he was left with wartime illness and disability that plagued him until he died in 1968. In fact, if you read the repat records, you can't help but pick up that a lot of his symptoms are suggestive of post-traumatic stress syndrome, but that was not diagnosed at that time. Here is Pummy with his wife, Ruby Beale. Pummy's thin, drawn, a cigarette hangs from his left hand. He maintained a lifetime relationship of love with Ruby when he returned from the war. Ruby had been deserted by an abusive husband in 1918, which is another aspect of the story. The photo was given to me by Pummy's great niece and was taken, I think, in the early 40s. Most of these ex-soldiers did not have job security. Frank Edwards was a fleet-footed centre three-quarter. He scored the first and the last try for the Lithgow Diggers. The last try 100 years ago today. That was in the knockout comp for the Peterson Cup. One thing you will not see in the sports articles of newspapers is the reason he did not play in the team on the day it won the premiership a few weeks earlier. 3 days before that premiership win, he walked out of the small arms factory at the end of his shift with a retrenchment notice clutched in his hands. He was discharged through lack of work. Was he likely too upset to play that weekend? Many people, Pummy included, were retrenched in 1921. I now turn to George Thorne. He was the youngest player in the team and was the captain. The role of captain fitted him like a glove. In 1915, as a 17-year-old, he captained the champion Bluebell team, second grade side, and he held the role as captain until he left for war in 1917. He was probably the most gifted fullback in the competition in a region that had great fullbacks. He tussled after his return from war with Eric Doig, Pummy's half-brother, for the captain's role. Bluebell did not hand the captain's job back to George when he returned from the war. You can see Eric's triumphant smile in 1919 as he holds the ball with George next to him, somewhat grim. But in 1920, George was the natural choice as captain of the Lithgow Diggers. Doig had left at that time to play for Western Suburbs in Sydney. Incidentally, the female mascot is Birdie Summons, the daughter of Jack Summons, who was a forward in the Diggers side. At the time of this photo, Jack was about to leave England for the front line. George had a touch of eccentricity. As a champion cricketer, captained the Western District side in Sydney in February 1930. His team played Riverina on the Saturday, and when he arrived at the ground on the Sunday to play Western Suburbs, he announced to his teammates casually that he had married his sweetheart, Gladys Clark, the previous night at North Sydney. He was also known to wear football boots fielding in cricket if the ground was greasy. Conversely, there were a few players in the team whose wartime disabilities were so severe that it's hard to imagine were able to play competitive rugby league. One that springs to mind is Gerald Sutton. Sutton fought at Gallipoli on the Western Front and suffered shell shock and a severe dislocation of his hip joint. In later life, he wore a caliper on his leg, yet he was a regular player over 2 seasons. He was fortunate to get in touch with his grandsons, Byrne and John Bastow. Gerald had proudly retained his premiership gold medals, and he left the 1920 medal to his grandsons. Another player who had an injury was Herbert Parker, but it was a disability he had lived with since childhood. To look at him in the photo, all you see is a 6-foot, broad-shouldered forward. But Parker had a deformed right foot as a result of falling into a fire when he was a 4-year-old. He was declared unfit in his hometown of Warren when he tried to enlist in 1915, but a sympathetic doctor in Dubbo gave him the green light 3 months later. When he arrived in Cairo, he was pulled out of his unit by a doctor and Lieutenant Colonel James Ramsey, who was scathing of the Australian enlistment authorities. The second toe is lost, he said. The great toe overextended, third toe deformed, permanently unfit. Parker was on the next ship back to Australia. He returned to Warren, but gratefully accepted employment with a small arms factory who were giving preference to disabled servicemen. And through that, he was introduced to the Lithgow Diggers team. You have to ask yourself, why were these men in the team? I think the answer to that question is that the Lithgow Diggers team was not simply about men winning trophies. Behind all the winning statistics, the story of men maintaining bonds of friendship and forming community as they transform back into civilian life. I just want to leave the Lithgow Diggers players and mention one of the non-players in the Thelma Ryan photograph, who was given a chapter in the book. Prior to the war, Vice President James Callaghan was a great Labor supporter, and during the war adored Billy Hughes' battle for conscription. James was also a lifetime football supporter. The pre-war team was the Gordons, and his sons played with that club before the war. 3 of them served in Europe. The 3 of them were killed in Europe. You can see how he has aged in the space of 5 years. The Telegraph photo was taken in 1916, he proudly sitting in front of his 3 sons before they left for France. And the one on the left is from the team photo in 1921. I think there's a big difference. When the Lithgow Rugby League team, Diggers team, formed after the war, James was one of the most ardent supporters. He became vice president, and immediately the players made him a life member as a gesture of sympathy. The story of Mary Callaghan, his wife, was harder to research. I could only imagine her grief. She laid the foundation stone of the War Memorial in Elizabeth Park. And she made a personal plea to the French General Pau when he visited Lithgow in 1918. She asked him to tend the graves of the Australian dead in France after the war. In the last part of this talk, I just want to lead you through some images of football life in Lithgow from the 19th century to 1921. This photo was supplied by Lithgow Library. Handwritten on the photo are the words "First Football Team in Lithgow," but there's no names of players, no team identification, no stately public buildings or well-appointed rooms here to try and date it. The photographer is noted as W. Bursey, who operated around Lithgow in the 1890s. It's interesting, though, on a number of levels. The background is the virgin bush. The goalposts can be seen behind the players to the left, tree branches strapped together. The players' long pants, stockings and high-laced boots clearly place it in the 19th century. Fortunately, at present, there is no supporting evidence to determine the team's precise identity. The next photo is one of my favourites. It oozes character. Hands draped over the shoulders, the variety of hats all the players are wearing, the casual sprawl of the two players in the front. Pity there are no names accompanying this photo. It was pretty rare to see photos in the country press around about this time. This cartoon was published in the National Advocate, Bathurst, on the 26th of April 1913. That year in Lithgow was the year Rugby League made its big move, with the small arms factory being most influential. It's a cartoon which reflects what many working class people thought of the tussle. You had the elderly traditional rugby union man unable to keep up with the young fleet-footed rugby league player. The ball carried by the rugby league man is marked popularity, and the caption reads, "Oh, Bertie is going to score." Another soldier and player was William Mullins, who came from a family of bandsmen and musicians. Billy, as he was known, was quite a character. He married a sister of fellow footballer Harry Hoy literally 2 days before he sailed for Europe. Harry Hoy was a centre three-quarter and Billy was his halfback. Billy wrote from Gallipoli that the place where he saw a charge was for all the world like the hill at the back of the ironworks. So I was on the lookout for a photograph of those hills, and I think this one from the Lithgow Family Historical Association fits in with Billy's letter. One of the things mentioned in the book was the search by the Rugby League Association for permanent grounds. At the beginning of the 1920 season, Trevor Jones offered his land behind the viaduct as a football area. It was a land fit for a cow paddock, probably was a cow paddock. It was snapped up by the association on a modest rental agreement. The players and supporters spent many days draining it to make it suitable for playing. I spent some time trying to locate the viaduct fields. I soon discovered there are quite a few viaducts in and around Lithgow. Then I found out in 1921 that in 1921, Jones decided to sell the land, and there was a combined effort by sporting groups to raise funds at a week-long carnival to buy it. Enough funds could not be raised, but fortunately the buyer, a Mr. I.E. Ibbott, Glanmere near Bathurst, was sympathetic with sport. Rugby league continued on the grounds. Eventually it became Glanmere Sports Ground. Once I knew that, the location fell into place, and it was icing on the cake when I found a photo in the University of Newcastle archives of the area. This photo was taken by Thomas Radini, a photographer, in about 1910, 1913. His wife, daughter, and their 2 dogs are in the foreground, and off in the background is the railway viaduct. You can see the hills of Lithgow further back. There's actually in the right-hand corner, there's I think a cow feeding at the base of the slope. Now, when you compare it to the modern photo of the area, you can see the relationship. The viaduct's still there, the slope that holds up the railway is there, and the Glanmere Sports Grounds are off to the right. I've learned a number of things in writing this book. I do not think you can do service to writing local history unless you draw into the narrative a history of the times. Sanford and Hoskin Ironworks, the industrial strikes, the rise of the small arms factory and its decay, the Spanish flu, etc., are all events that these men and their families lived through, formed their characters. In writing local history or family history, we collect mounds of facts and dates. What we have to learn is what facts and dates to leave out of our story. We have to write to entertain, not only to inform. If I included every fact, date, every score and every match, then not only would the story be incredibly long, but it would be terribly boring. The hard part in writing is identifying the bits to make a good story. That was one of the biggest challenges for me. The other important aspect of writing local history is that you cannot do it all on your own. You cannot rely solely on trove. You have to work from the ground up. Talk to local history societies, librarians, curators of museums. Relatives of the subject you write about are essential friends. But finding relatives of subjects who died more than 50 years ago is difficult on your own. Probably one of the hardest jobs. A great niece of Poe Mantle was only introduced to me by Kay Shirt, the local studies officer at Lithgow Library, and the only person in the Thelma Ryan photograph I could not crack, Mackenzie MacDonald, was hanging on the wall of Lithgow and District Family History Society as a portrait. That brings me to the end of my talk. Thanks very much for listening to me. I hope I've added some cement to the building of local history in a country town and some commentary on rugby league history in this state. My thanks go to Jan Saundercock from Lithgow and District Family Historical Society, Kay Shirt from Lithgow Library, and also my sons, Thorne and Chris, with technical advice on Zoom and web pages. I'm happy to try and answer any questions you have. And thank you very much.